Alex's daughters. And Emmy, so Emmy and we have Amelia, they're both fourth grade.
So she's actually emailing me than I did.
Oh, is she Amelia? Okay, well, we have the Amelia. And so this, girls are going to come up on their last year. And what's that?
Yeah, let's try and decide what middle school. She's not sure.
Is Allie at BA?
She wasn't BA.
Oh, she's not now?
She's not now.
Oh.
She changed her schedule. She wasn't gonna get home until after kids were home.
Oh,
And I thought, I know.
Right.
She'd take that for time.
Yeah. So she's trying to decide what they're gonna do about middle school.
Yeah, because her kids obviously are more musicians than they are athletes. And she's worried that Brentwood High is like really great for athletes and not as great for musicians.
I understand. I hear
So,
that.
so she wanted to funnel her kids into a middle.
Right. Yeah.
Have a high school.
I understand. Yeah. Well, there will be, what I have found in Williamson County, my kids didn't do that, but a lot of them, there will be a significant number that will go on into the private schools. From the four middles. I don't know that Amanda is considering that or not. Her grandchildren and my grandchildren are at the same school and in the same grade.
Oh,
So,
I love that it's such a small world.
yeah.
Your connections.
Yeah. Oh, and her grandson and James were baptized here on the same Sunday.
I have a soft place in my heart for James. I don't really know James, but the scientist at heart.
Yeah.
He's curious.
Rosemary is starting to purge some things and
Downsizing.
downsize, but it was
It was magnifying.
glass, but a single eye one, yeah.
Yeah, it was a little black, brown thing like that, and then you flip out two different lenses, and you could magnify or super magnify them. Hold it up.
So, she was describing this in a group that we were with, and she said, no, who would want this? She pulled it out and she
I
said,
said, I have all this stuff and nobody wants anything, and it's like,
and I said, I do people. And she gave it to me and I gave it to James, our grandson.
it was at my father's actually.
Yeah. Hey, I have started following on Instagram Mississippi State, agriculture, cause they have the best posts and the most informative posts.
And they have, you go into the school, there's my dad's name.
Know that. Well, one of my neighbor's son is in, aquaculture at Mississippi State.
Now, Daddy didn't go there, but he supported, my brother did.
Oh,
And so-
okay.
And so he became.
But your dad taught there.
No, he didn't.
Oh, he didn't?
And he taught it at Stephen F. Austin and at Boches.
Oh, okay.
All right. But, he just became a good supporter of it because George.
I think they have a really good program.
They do.
Joseph.
They do.
They told her.
I mean, I'll have to leave early to come back up.
You rush your boat on, double duty, huh?
Well, we just weren't sure how what the youth were gonna do, how they're gonna participate or not.
Yeah.
So I was kind of superfluous today, but not too much.
Yeah. Were you at early church?
I was not. I was driving up.
Okay, because, this is senior Sunday.
I know, I saw.
And we have traditions here that are.
Everybody gets Kleenex, cause you.
Everybody needs, yeah. And I love.
Even if you don't have children.
And then Adam had even prolonged it when he said, everybody turn around and look at the, before the benediction, everybody turn around and look at the seniors and he talked.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
I'm crying too.
I was in the parlor and, this young man came in, right kind of past the peace point. And, I said, morning, welcome. He said, this is my first time here. I'm just in town. I'm out of town. And I just wanted to come. And I was like, oh, wonderful. And he goes, wow, this is really lively for 8:30. I said,
It was packed. It's like Easter Sunday.
All the teenagers are here.
Yeah, I guess that would be a shock if somebody.
They were in there, but I kicked them all out. We can go back.
But it was funny, but I got to see him afterwards, I'm like, that's nice, this guy. And he said, I'd like to speak to one of your ministers, I'm gonna be here for a couple months. Donovan and Stephanie were kind of like there, I'm like, guys got this, where's the minister? He was saying, here's the guy. I go,
Yeah, one thing when you said that reminded me, this is years ago, there was a lady visiting here because her daughter was sick and she came. And she came to our, Thursday morning Bible study, and we're talking God this and with Donovan that, and she says, you call your pastors by their first name?
I didn't think about that.
In some congregations, that's how it is.
You don't do that.
They have different cultures.
It is a culture.
Yeah.
It is a culture, yeah.
Absolutely, yeah.
All right, so when were you at the Synod of the Northeast?
I was in the Synod of the Northeast, let's see, it would have been, 1983, 84, okay, 1989.
We lived in New Jersey at the time, so we were members of.
Where were you?
Synod. Red Bank, New Jersey.
Oh, sure, I know Red Bank. I grew up in Morris County, New Jersey.
Morristown. My parents were married in 1935 and lived in Morristown, New Jersey.
Oh, my God.
So there's connections no matter where you go.
Yeah.
I have one.
What's that?
Where was your church in Marietta?
Ray Thomas Memorial.
Okay.
It's East Cobb.
Very good.
Yeah.
Sandy Springs.
Okay.
Convert Presbytery.
Yeah. Oh, beautiful church.
When were you in seminary in Princeton?
So I was in seminary, I graduated in 1980.
Yeah, that's the year after we moved to New Jersey.
Okay.
Yeah, so how long were you there altogether?
So, well, let's see, I actually grew up in a town called Whippany. You're here, Whippany? It was
Whitney, we know, yeah.
Yeah, Whippany, land of soap factory back in the day, paper mill. Yeah, glamorous. Ugh. So, yeah, so I lived in New Jersey until I went to Rochester. We were called to a church up in Rochester. And that was like 1982 or so.
Yeah.
But I had been active with the Synod almost immediately. They had a mission council that was doing things my first call was the Morristown Presbyterian Church. And they wanted me to do something to serve the larger church. So that's what I did. And then I wound up on staff.
Terrific.
Yeah.
Wasn't Rita on staff?
As Synod.
Yeah, the woman we were just talking about, as a layperson, remember what she did.
I can't remember exactly the specifics about that.
Yeah.
It was.
Synods were huge back then.
Yeah.
We had 13 people on our staff. And now,
Now most people don't even know there is.
I know, I'm not sure what Synods do anymore. I mean, the need for them is
Yeah.
really
Yeah.
changing technology.
Exactly. It's interesting how technology could change something like that.
Exactly.
Was it the Presbytery that
She did both, but she was with the Synod for a while.
Okay. Rita Hood?
They might have been a little bit. Well,
Did you eat lunch yesterday?
their first child was.
They got supposed to, I thought we were supposed to start, I think we were supposed to wait for a storm.
We usually, most places start around 10.
We will wait for them. People are.
People in the parlor visiting.
Okay.
And this Sunday, I think there may be still some of their parents, friends of the seniors,
Right.
whatever else.
Well, as you know, Guy's away, so,
His office door was open, so we don't know if he's here or not.
no, he's not.
He's not,
And
okay.
I think he stayed on in Europe after the.
I knew he had, but, Stephanie thought he was back today, but I can't imagine.
No.
Did he stay on?
I think that's,
He's
I
not.
think
He's.
they were staying a little bit longer.
Yeah, because I think the trip, I was talking to,
The trip got back
Sylvia,
yesterday.
they just got back Friday.
Okay,
So I mentioned they were gonna stay more than just a couple of days on, I think.
From the Holland trip, they're already back.
Yeah, they just got back, what, Friday, you said?
On Friday,
Yeah.
yeah. So they had a wonderful time, the weather was perfect.
I know it's beautiful. Keep an eye on them. You're married.
He's flirting.
How you doing, Ken?
I saw, Jim Phelps yesterday at, ThinkWorks.
Huh?
And he and Beth were supposed to go on that trip and she got sick at the very last minute and they did not get, they were not able to go. Beth Phelps got sick, so Jim and Beth did not go at the, literally like the day before Beth got sick.
Oh my gosh.
Mm.
Huh. Cause I saw him and I said, oh, how was your trip? And he said, we didn't go.
Oh.
Mhm.
You mean you didn't go just about?
They went to, yeah, they went to Belgium to see the trip. Guy was talking about
I didn't know I was saying it.
But you went kind of social media.
reformation.
Extra ticket.
Still trying to decide, I think, you gotta talk, preach,
Not
not
talking
Yeah.
totally, depraved. And tulip message,
Must not
which
snore.
Yeah.
kind of scary here.
Should have done that down here.
I did sneak one donut though. One thing, last week was a disaster week, food, nutrition wise. That was my birthday.
I can qualify that. I said it was a disaster.
So I moved to the Blackford, which is independent living place, and you don't tell your secrets like it's my birthday without paying a price for it. And so the chef comes out and
Oh, wow.
just packed everything, and he says, I'm going to make you a cheesecake with mocha mousse on it.
Oh, wow.
Whoa, okay. Handle that, and it was delicious. But the whole week has been kind of sweets.
You know, we drove the church bus for Good Friday.
Yeah.
Ann went with me there. We get off the bus and Roy out says, "Ann, let me give you a tour." Dan comes back to the bus and says, "We gotta get on the waiting list."
You know, the lady.
Yeah, like 5 years.
Oh, is it really?
Yeah.
Wow, wow. How long were you on it?
I was on it about a year, but I turned down two apartments.
Oh, you did?
But I just,
Waiting for the right one?
I was.
Okay.
The view was not what I wanted, and then she said, I know the floor plan isn't the one you want, just come and look at it. And so I went over and I said, okay, I love it, it's mine. The view is out into the cherry blossoms, and then down the little hill to the lake. Nice. It's like I'm out in the country and I'm right here in Green Hill.
Wow. My mother is 101.
Wow.
Sort of, kind of.
Wow.
Asterisk.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. We would love her to go into a lovely spot. She likes her house.
Where is she?
She's in Alpharetta, Georgia.
Oh, okay.
She used to be 11 minutes from me, but
And that's God's stomping ground out there.
it is, I know, yeah, that's where Guy and I met.
Okay, okay.
I preached, when I went to the church, it was called to the Church of Marietta. I did my candidacy sermon is what I'm trying to say, at God's church. So he had gone to Princeton, but he's a little younger than I am, so.
Okay.
Young Georgia 400 with our own private drag strip.
Wow.
Nobody.
Well, as I said, when I moved in 1990, when we moved to Marietta, it took 11 minutes to get to my parents' house. They moved shortly after we did, and it's about 25 now. Someday I'm coming to Brentwood where my daughter is, and hoping that the traffic doesn't follow me.
I think it's receding.
Yeah, I gotta say.
They're terrible drivers. I don't know that you want to do that. Maybe she should follow you.
Oh, they're here.
They're here, are they?
They're here. Yeah.
Where is Ally now? You said she's not a Big A.
No, she does the things here at the church, but
Oh,
they had
okay.
changed the schedule,
Uh-huh,
so it didn't fit her schedule.
right, uh-huh.
So she's just volunteering for 1,000 things.
Yeah, yeah,
Enjoying,
Good.
really have to work,
uh-huh,
so,
that's nice.
yeah.
That's really good. I bet we can get started.
You think?
Yeah,
Okay, what about Zoom? We worry about Zoom?
It's on.
I think it's on.
Oh,
Yeah.
I think he came and set it up.
okay. Yeah, he said he'd be back to do it, but okay. Well, so as many of you know, I am redheaded Ally Harvard's mom. She's the one who does the children's choirs, loves working with children and youth. Went to Blair Music School, and that's how I first came to Vanderbilt in this area, and actually began to be introduced to Westminster, because even as a student, she became involved in Westminster. When I retired from my church down in Marietta, I thought we were gonna move up sooner. So I started to watch Westminster online, which is one of the gifts of the COVID pandemic. Is that all the churches are now online. So I thought, I need to really learn this church, because you've got fantastic music. But for those of us that don't know how to read music, trying to figure out how to follow along, I thought, I'm gonna need a lot of years of practice before I get up there and make a fool of myself in the sanctuary. But I do worship with you from afar, and when I'm in town, I stop in. But that means that I was listening in to Donovan's Easter sermon, which I loved. But he mentioned in that sermon, what I realized was a great segue to what this program is about. He mentioned, I remember he mentioned that there was a woman in a church he'd served who had stayed in the narthex and refused to go into the sanctuary. Donovan said he didn't know exactly why she was out there, maybe anxiety or something, but it didn't really matter, because by then, and I don't know if this happens to you, but my mind wanders during sermons, and my mind started to wander to all the people that I have known who, at least metaphorically, have stayed in the narthex and not come in to the sanctuary. I remember years ago, we had one of our most wonderful youth members sang in the choir, did all the things. You probably know the names of those from today's service of who they are for Westminster. Well, her dad died suddenly and tragically. And probably about 3 weeks or so after his death, she was in the youth choir singing again. And they were singing an anthem, which professed faith in all of God's actions and absolute confidence that everything that happens is part of God's good plan. And the chorus that they were singing over and over and over was, all you do is good. And after the service, she came over to me in my office, wanting to talk privately, and she said, I gotta tell you, I couldn't sing the anthem. I couldn't even really say those words. And I assured her that God understands her pain and even wants her to voice it. And she said something that just struck me. She said, yeah, God understands, but does the church? There are times in our lives when, and I think all of you have lived long enough to know this, sometimes it's hard to praise God. If you're angry with God, if you have doubts, sometimes even in church, you can feel alone. We try to make space for the whole range of how we are with God. But the truth is, in most churches, we don't talk about these things publicly. that much, especially in the worship service, where it would be, I honestly, agree, it would be awfully odd and awkward and hard if in sharing the peace of Christ, you said, the peace of the Lord be with you, and somebody responded, I'm not sure about the Lord. Then what do you say?
I'm glad you're here.
I'm glad you're here. Well, and the other thing that I've noticed that we tend to do in churches is, when we mention doubt, where we often mention it? It's in the prayer of confession. And I can't tell you how many, particularly young church visitors, picked up on that my day and said, so is it a sin to doubt? And of course, it's not a sin to doubt. When Donovan preached that Easter sermon, I'm sure that if you pressed him, he could have come up with a whole lot of other people that he could mention and remember who are out there in the metaphorical darkness. And part of what has brought me to the place to be talking about the lectionary the way I will today is because, though I have two daughters, and you know the one, but the other one would be out in the narthex, if even in the church door, with that woman. Years ago, back in 1997, she was barely a teenager. And our older daughter began to show signs of all kinds of distress. Something was going terribly wrong. And I don't know, how it was for any of you who raised children and they got to the teenage years, but that need for a manual was really big. And I read all the manuals that I could get, but there was nothing that seemed to cover what we were going through with her. And we were really worried because she was giving us all kinds of mixed signals and nothing was making any sense. She went from being a really happy fifth grader to this kid in sixth and seventh grade who I didn't even recognize anymore. We had a neighbor across the street. He was a youth leader in a local church, and he told me that she had confided in him that the trouble was some peers that were after her. And he said to me, I've been praying with her, I've been coaching her, but I could see that things were getting worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. And one night, I did what, well, you can't do anymore because everybody got cell phones. But back in the day, there were landlines. And so I decided I gotta start listening to phone calls. I've got to find out what is going wrong with his child. So one night, the first night I was listening, I picked up the phone and it was that neighbor's voice. Only he was not praying with my daughter. He was coaching her to kill us so he could take her. There are times in life where all that normal floor that you think you're walking on just evaporates and you're suddenly thrown into this black hole of hell. And that was one of them for us. I probably would have liked at that point in time to have been with that woman and my daughter in the narthex and not coming into the sanctuary either, but I was the senior pastor of a church. And you know that when you have a senior pastor of a church, you expect them to be up in the pulpit in the sanctuary, not in the back of the narthex, wondering how they feel about God. But that's sort of where I was. But you have to keep preaching. So I did. But I used a lectionary. And most of you, I think, know what that is. It's that 3-year cycle of readings that Presbyterian pastors use to keep us on track, to help us not just give our favorite sermons all the time or our whims or whatever, to be disciplined in preaching. But week after week, when I was in this new place of hell, the passages just were, I was finding it impossible to connect with them. The lectionary was kept singing praises. And I couldn't sing it with them, like that girl after the death of her dad. And I found instead my way into the Psalms and the lament Psalms and the Psalms of complaint and the Psalms of screaming. And then I found my way into all the texts that are missing from the lectionary, texts that we avoid because they are texts of violence, texts of victims, texts of abandonment from God, texts with graphic images that no pastors want to preach. So I read those and found myself saying, thanks be to God for them, because I could experience them and pray them and be with them in a way in which they shared my shock and my grief and my horror, and it was cathartic. Now I know that, Christians, again, are not immune from tragedies. And some people find comfort in thinking it's all part of God's mysterious plan, and that works for them, and they affirm that the Bible has a word for them, and they didn't go through what I went through, but others of us, no, we don't get to that easy place as easily. We wonder, how did a God of love let this happen? My older daughter later asked me to explain where God was when she was being molested and groomed and coached. And all I could tell her was, I was still asking God the same thing. More than a few people are thrown into theological crisis when something really slams them in life. And what I discovered over the course of my ministry since in the lectionary is that we begin sometimes to lose people. Because if the lectionary week after week after week just talks about praising God and nothing about complaint, if it says our doubt is a sin, if it doesn't talk about their pain in a way in which they feel like they are really heard and accepted for that pain, they may do more than just stay in the narthex, they may just leave. And the thing that always worries me is we Presbyterian churches want visitors, and we want to keep the visitors. We want the visitors to turn into members. But sometimes people come sniffing around churches because they're in pain. And if we don't speak to that pain, they don't stay. The lectionary has a lot of good features. But unfortunately, it tends to lean towards affirming that God is very much in control and tends to avoid dwelling on the horror that is out there. And the preferred texts lead and lean into praise, and they tend to avoid conflict. And when I did my dissertation on this, I discovered that there was more missing than I realized. After going through all the lectionary and the Bible, I found out 87% of the Old Testament is missing from the lectionary. And 48% of the New Testament is missing. That's a lot. That's a lot. And I know, and Rosemary was saying that her small group sometimes have touched some of these texts. They are difficult texts and hard to proclaim from the pulpit. So I get why we shy away from them. But the effect of these editions is too often hurting people remain like the text themselves, silenced. Silenced like that young woman who did not want anybody else to know that she could hardly sing that anthem. And I think that's the really hard thing, is people don't want anybody else to know. As though they just are waving a big flag that says faith failure. And they're not. But too many people remain convinced that their complaints and afflictions are either a sign of lack of faith or that they did something wrong to deserve this. And many are led to believe that the very things that they are thinking and feeling are against the correct theology of the church. Especially because we as pastors are called to present good news. And that gets really tough in the pulpit. I watch Donovan all the time, and I think he tries to do a really noble effort at acknowledging pain and bringing it in. But the bind that the lectionary puts us in, and our sense of our need to keep presenting the good news, is that it makes it hard on the people still in the Northeast. I noticed that in the Easter sermon, he brought in the good news. Eventually she came into the sanctuary. Yay, thanks be to God. And that's great for her. But it's still painful for the other ones in that metaphorical Northeast, not sure they're ever going to be part of the club. It's a predicament that the best preachers in the world find themselves in. And you've got one of them. But it's the predicament of the lectionary. Well, let me emphasize again, and I think from your nodding that you know this, the things the people are feeling are very, very biblical. All those feelings. Did you know that the New Testament draws more heavily on the Psalms than any other book of the Old Testament? But 1/3 of the Psalter are complaint psalms. 1/3. Screaming at God, yelling at God, mad at God, that's 1/3. But unfortunately, those are not the psalms that we're singing. If you listen, you have beautiful cantors and other people coming up and singing the songs together, but you're usually not singing about smashing babies' heads against the rocks and where are you, where are you, where are you? You're singing, the Lord is my shepherd. I often started to tell people in my church that even if I was not preaching on some of the missing texts, and I confess I did begin to preach on them, but the way to sometimes find where some of the good stuff is for the people in the Northeast is if you notice in a scripture passage that it'll say verses 1-3, and whoop, 16.
Yeah. Psalm 139.
Yeah. Exactly. The good stuff for the people in pain is often that omitted stuff. Now, back to the other problem that we face in churches is that to compound the problem with the lectionary, a lot of churches base the anthems and the hymns, and even some of them, the Sunday school, on the lectionary. But guess what that means? That 87% and 48% remains hidden in a lot of places. So I want to name for you some of the stories that are missing from the lectionary. I'd like you to listen for how many you recognize or don't. And listen for what surprises you. But what do you mean it's not in the lectionary? Stories that you may know very well. Or for references to stories, again, that you don't recognize. In Genesis alone, among the texts silenced by the lectionary, are the curses upon Adam and Eve, the murder of Abel by Cain, Abraham and Sarah's trip to Egypt, in which Abraham allows Sarah to be used sexually, claiming she was his sister, the quarrel between Abraham and Lot, the lengthy distress of Hagar and Ishmael, the raw account of Lot and his daughters, Abraham's second round of claiming Sarah was his sister for the same reason, and Isaac's claim that his wife Rebecca was his sister, also for the same reason, like father, like son. Jacob's theft of Esau's blessing and subsequent flight from home, Esau's pained attempt to please his parents by marrying a Hebrew wife. Desperate competition between Leah and Rachel. Jacob's eventual reconciliation with Esau that took forever. Dinah's rape and the revenge of her brothers. Reuben's abuse of Bilhah. Judah's abuse of Tamar. And the majority of the story of Joseph. In the lectionary, Moses never comes before God in exhaustion and complains about the Hebrew people yelling, "Am I their parent?" Nope, not in there. Gideon never begs for signs from God. Jephthah's daughter is never sacrificed due to her dad's terrible theology. Samson is never betrayed by Delilah. The Levite's concubine is never dismembered. The girls of Shiloh are never seized by the Benjamites. Samuel never cries all night because God is grieved for having made Saul king. David and Jonathan never weep together. 1 Samuel never declares that Saul took his own life. Amnon never rapes Tamar. Absalom never kills Amnon. Ezra and Nehemiah never cope with opposition. The speeches of Job's friends are never heard. And God's anger with their lousy theology is not voiced. Ecclesiastes never looks at the tears of the oppressed. The majority of Isaiah's woes are silenced. Neither Jeremiah nor God writhe in pain. Jeremiah is never imprisoned or put in a cistern. Obadiah never has a vision. Jonah never runs away from God's call. Much of the depth of God's pain in Hosea is silenced, as are the threats that we don't like to read. The horrific pain cries and visions of most of the latter prophets are hushed. In the lectionary, Jesus never curses a fig tree, and most of the stories about his anger are skipped over. Ananias and Sapphira never engage in deceit. Stephen's speech, as he's being stoned, is not heard, and while the lectionary does say Stephen was martyred, it doesn't ever tell us about the ministry that caused him to be martyred. The blunt accounts of Paul's scourge of the church and the disciples' fear of him is unheard. The woman caught in the act of adultery isn't mentioned, and therefore neither is the hypocrisy of the community. In the Revised Common Lectionary, the difficult passages on mutual submission in Ephesians and Colossians are eliminated. And the only book in the Old Testament written to the chosen lady and her children is completely omitted. And more still than these are missing. I don't even have time to tell you the 87% and 48%. And though individual Christians may stumble on these or be blessed enough to be part of a small group Bible study that talks about it, largely kept under wraps for so many church members, particularly the ones who do not go to Bible studies, is the inherent proclamation within any of these stories that terrible, unspeakable things happen to faithful people under God's sovereign rule. And that faithful people may doubt God's ever-present presence, or complain and challenge God's love and justice. And it silences too often that marginalized, victimized people are not to blame for the things that are questionable. In their moment of pain, the psalmist argued and accused that terrible things have happened because God was absent, not listening, not paying attention. He turned away. God's someplace. Where were you? Scripture dares to ask, where was God when Dinah was being raped? And where was God when Jephthah's daughters being killed? Even the lectionary, though, does admit that Jesus himself felt abandoned by God. Why have you forsaken me? But we seem to be afraid to admit the rest of us can sometimes feel that too. The thing is, what the Psalms know is that even if you are raising your fist to God in anger, you're still engaged with God. And every relationship that matters thrives on this wonderful thing called honesty. And when we can't be honest with God, or even with each other about how we're feeling about God, then all the relationships suffer, including ours with the Lord. Since so many of the lectionary texts were missing, I did decide in my ministry and in the dissertation process that I needed to find out for my own sake if anybody other than me would find some of these texts powerful. And I realized that I couldn't just start preaching all the texts missing from the lectionary. I wanted to stay faithful to the lectionaries, faithful to the balance. I didn't want to drag the poor congregation through everything I was going through at every level. So I decided instead, I was going to invite people to Bible studies made for people in pain. And that's how we advertised it. If life was just rosy-dosy for you, you don't need to come. But those who needed to come came. And the effect, it was so profound for all of us. Just out of curiosity, did all of you remember or recognize 100% of the Bible omissions that I mentioned? Anybody get them all?
I got one. One, they included in 7th grade Sunday school lesson a few years ago. And you get these kids and they've heard it all 1,000 times, but nobody had ever heard of Jephthah.
Ah.
And I knew the Jephthah story as a cliffhanger. And that we just go verse by verse. And at the very end, I go, well, what do you think happened?
What do you think happened?
And they're stunned. Yeah, it's in the Bible.
It's in the Bible.
They're just stunned.
Yeah. You know, and I gotta tell you, I think that probably impacted kids far more than my 7th grade teacher who was teaching us the Westminster Confession. So here was the thing, that actually maybe it's the blessing of these things being missed by the lectionary. We don't necessarily know. And that actually is opportunity. Because one of the things that is always a challenge, and if you've ever led a Bible study, you know this. One of the great challenges of leading Bible studies is help people hear with new ears. How do we hear this passage and really hear it? With our hearts, with our souls, with our lives? How do we really engage the story? Because the trouble is, if we know the story really well, it's easy to turn off. I know this one. I got it. My 7th grade teacher told me what it meant. And so I'm done. And now I can think about what I have to do after church. But if you don't know it, you've got a half of an opportunity to really listen. And that's what happened in these studies. Most of these stories were unknown. My group were not lucky enough to have somebody right out of Jephthah. They'd never heard, and they were horrified. And they were horrified by so many of them, but also horrified that we didn't talk about it because they knew stories equally as horrifying from their real lives.
Will you tell me the story of Jephthah? Because I don't.
Yeah, her
What,
dad.
Doc, will you tell me?
I can tell you, her just as the version is, Dad's promises to God that if he wins this battle, the first thing he sees when he returns home again, he's gonna sacrifice. Cause he's thinking lamb, goat, something like that. But his precious daughter comes running out. And he's determined, according to the story, we don't know how it ended, he's determined to keep that promise to God. So last scene, she's off having a time with her
Last
friends.
sentence, something like, and Jephthah did as he had promised to God.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they just go, wow, you gotta be kidding.
Yeah. It's a great lesson in bad theology.
Yeah.
Yeah. So these stories have stories, and the thing is, in today's world, there's a lot of bad theology. It could do us well to be talking about the effects of bad theology. So we began to teach, to go through, I didn't even say the word teach, because I wasn't really teaching these stories. We were reading the stories together and lifting them up and connecting them to people's lives. And the impact was absolutely stunning and profound. I want to emphasize that, again, these are difficult stories. This is not, thanks be to God, go and do likewise. This is, you gotta unpack it, you gotta talk about it, and you need to be in a place where you can do that in a supportive environment. Because if you go through this and you don't let people talk about their pain in the midst of it, you've wasted the opportunity. So this is not the kind of thing you do in a class of 50 people. This is something you do in a small group, and that's what we did. We had no more than 7 to 11 people in any one of the different sessions. I just ran a lot of sessions. But, yeah.
Were you surprised at the number of people that wanted to participate in this kind of setting?
I was surprised, and I was surprised by the number of stories, because I had been their pastor at that point for about 7 years.
So you knew them.
So I knew them, and I was surprised by the number of stories that they had not confessed publicly. It's a hard thing to talk about, even, we don't. So let me share with you just some of the things that came out in these studies to give you an idea. For one man, he had a broken relationship with his siblings and his father, but now his father was dying. And you can imagine how difficult that would be. He decided he wanted to say goodbye, but you've got this dynamics and you've got resentment and the lack of forgiveness and anger and all that messy stuff in the midst of a place that's already loaded because dad is dying. But it was taking dad time. So he had time, ironically, for the Bible study. And for him, it was the stories of Jacob and Esau that proved life-giving. That family tension where you can explore and talk about brothers who don't get along and had permission, because this was in the Bible. And then there was a man with a malignant brain tumor, glioblastoma, and he and his wife found some of the stories powerful, enabling them to talk about their fear. That they didn't feel like they had to say they had faith that this was part of God's good plan. Because they had 2 young kids. They did not feel like if this was God's plan, God made a mistake in the plan as far as they were concerned. And they hadn't been able to talk about that. People were supporting them and helping them and walking through them, but they were still afraid to say in the big church how terrified they were. And all their mixed feelings. And yet they were also able to talk about those elusive moments of the presence of God, even in the midst of times when they felt most abandoned by God. And it was powerful for everybody. The study of the Levite and the concubine led to one woman's telling what she had never told, and that is that she was a victim of child molestation. Don't talk about that. Another young woman was sure that the reason that we've omitted the rape of Dinah is because, as she said at the first session, polite people do not speak of such things. And then she spoke again about the time she was babysitting, and when the dad was driving her home, he raped her. And she had been carrying that weight for years because she thought you could never say such a thing if you were a Christian. Because it shouldn't happen to a Christian. She also had brilliant observation. She observed that the lectionary skipped over Dinah, silencing her, as if she didn't matter. But because Dinah wasn't forgotten in scripture, This young woman said, that means that God hadn't forgotten me. And the story became inspiration to her. The Psalms of complaint led to a sense of peace as people discovered that it is okay to scream at God. God can take it. It's fine. And they shared with each other those times where they didn't want anybody to know how they felt. Driving in the car, yelling and screaming, going in their bedroom, slamming the door, yelling and screaming. And when they were equipped with words from scripture that they could actually use, they felt that to be such a gift. So they used some of the words. I loved that for a lot of people, the story about Cain and Abel was like a balm for parents dealing with teenagers who were having issues. Because it gave them the opportunity to begin to talk about all the dynamics of, again, people not seeing eye to eye, shall we say, not getting along, people not behaving right, and also trying to identify with God as the parent of troublesome children, so that they could feel like, God does understand this, and surely God does, because we are troublesome children. And when they discovered Abraham wasn't such a saint, that they thought King David was definitely not any kind of saint, it helped them begin to wrestle not only what was going on in their own lives, but also there were rich conversations about where are parents responsible and where are we not responsible for what the kids do. What are the limits? Are there limits? I mean, these conversations were very honest and open. One of the members had a secret that this was a relatively new member and she had a son in jail. She didn't want people to know initially until she came to the Bible study. But he was an addict and he just kept going back to jail. And she needed to talk about, was there something she could have done differently? Was there not anything she could have done differently? What do you do when your kids get taken? And stories of demon possession that sometimes we don't talk that much about were very important to her because she felt like that addiction was a demon. And I think most of us would agree. So a lot of parents found a lot in the stories of Genesis. There's a lot of family dysfunction in Genesis. So for people who need to talk about that, there's a lot of material. And then not the least of which is a gift to parents. And my daughter says in Brentwood, this is a real thing. And it certainly was a real thing in Marietta, Georgia. We have a lot of kids that are entitled. And that runs into some problems. And Genesis overlaps violence and entitlement and explores it in really powerful ways. And the reality is, I think in our society, we're dealing with violence and entitlement, or at least violence and my rights. Where can we struggle? I mean, that's the fight over gun control. How much do we let people have guns? How much do we not? What's the balance of rights to the needs of the community about violence? These are conversations that are very relevant. They're Genesis.
I don't think gun control rights people have ever looked at Genesis.
It would be a really good book.
It would be.
It would be a very good book because there's violence in Genesis and a whole lot of reasons why in 20-minute sermons we don't try to cover it.
And what's constitutionally given is not necessarily what's biblically given.
Right, and what's good, what somebody considers their personal rights is not necessarily good for the community. And those are the things that Genesis explores. Only a few people found the discussions uncomfortable. And again, people who never were invited to talk about these things, and yet even they finally found something, every one of them, at least one thing that they said, I am glad for that. So a lot of them found in the Jacob stories that a lot of people struggle with forgiveness. And forgiveness is a tough thing. And in those stories, there's eventual reconciliation, but it takes like a lifetime. And that helped people who were in the process and couldn't get there. I mean, I've won. I've got somebody in prison. I haven't forgiven him quite yet. I'm not sure if I ever will. 'Cause forgiveness can take a long time. I mean, real forgiveness. And sometimes we just have to leave that up to God. So the stories matter to them in profound ways, and they even found that the stories of God's wrath that we don't like to talk about, where God's making these real threats, were also kind of cathartic, because when you have been very hurt and violated, you have an anger that kind of justice would feel good. I mean, there's a lot of times I would really wish God would come out of heaven and just smite somebody.
Yeah.
But, you know, that's balanced obviously with the stories of grace, which we also want, because we want those for us. So these texts made an enormous difference, and it also made a difference. Again, I want to emphasize this, because I don't want you to go tell Donovan he has to start preaching on these. But I think in a small group environment, the more we can have churches in small groups with people in pain, because that's the other thing. The fastest thing that would have killed the experience for these people is if somebody who had never experienced any pain just came in and preached to them that they were wrong. So we had to make sure that nobody who hadn't been through it was gonna dive bomb the Bible studies. And no one did. And to this day, people remember those, and what I love, they're continuing to recreate them as they've gone away, as they've moved into retirement communities, as they've gone to other churches. They're doing it over and over and over, because there are so many people out in the North Texas. So many, so many. So that's where we are today. I'm not sure why Guy asked me after all these years. I mean, I did this dissertation when I was getting my doctorate with Guy at Columbia, when neither one of us had gray hair. This was a lot of years ago, and only God would remember a colleague's dissertation.
Yeah.
So
Have you seen his office?
I have not seen his office.
That would even make it more surprising that he would remember.
I have not. I
His
have
office
not,
is
but
full.
well, I would believe that. I did believe that. So I think that there was probably a reason God wanted me to share this. I'm not sure I know what the reason is. You can ask him when he gets back from his travels. But maybe it's because he thinks there's even more space at Westminster for these conversations. And I think with the pastor's heart, and I know all your pastors have pastors' hearts, every pastor is looking for opportunities so that the Narthex people feel welcome in the club. And so that's why I'm here. That's why I wanted to share this with you. And I want to ask if any of you have any more comments or questions.
My guess is that we've all been in the Northeast at some point.
I suspect so. Yeah.
We had a quote, Friday, I was many years ago, and stuff when the guy that wasn't there, and so the whole secondhand, but he said, you know, it's really tough to be a failure as part of this church.
There you go.
And I just thought, yeah, I guess it would, yeah.
Well, and you know, I know Westminster doesn't have the prosperity gospel going, but it's out there, loud in our culture. And that sense that if you're blessed, it's blessed, you know, because you're really better or whatever, if you deserved it, and therefore the one whose life fell apart.
What did you do to deserve that?
What did you do to deserve that?
And I had a aunt, this was back in the early 90s, and she died from breast cancer. Her family told her, and she was my aunt by marriage, so her family told her that she had this disease because she was not faithful with them. And I'm sure she must have taken that to her grave, and that has always stayed with me.
Well,
And I don't think that they I knew her siblings, and I'm not sure that they were saying that to be hurtful to her. It's what they had been taught. I mean, it's what you're talking about. Going beyond just the good things in the Bible. We were very, very hard things to talk about and to understand,
well, and I think sometimes we don't realize when we try to rush to happy,
yeah.
what we're saying, or the bad theology that comes spilling out of our mouths. I mean, my older daughter, who is still an Orthodox, if she even sets foot in a church, because mostly she doesn't. It's not, and she always wants, she says, tell people, it's not just that I'm mad at God, she is. But it's not just that, it's the way that the church let her down, even our church, and we had a good church. But there were a few too many people who said to her that she deserved.
Oh,
And there were too few many former church members who said to me, I was a terrible mother because I trusted a youth pastor and believed it. It didn't somehow have ESP. So we say these things that just could devastate people. And some, like my older daughter, don't ever want to come back. Because as far as she's concerned, it's just hypocrite city.
I think that sometimes people say, if you haven't, that you deserve it, basically. It's their mechanism to say, this isn't gonna happen to me.
Right, that's exactly what it is.
Fine.
And I think that's, and I know with rape and child molestation and those kinds of things, in talking with others, that is very much what it is. It's because we don't see it. Sometimes Uncle Fred, or Aunt Sue or whatever. You're so blindsided by this. People are so terrified it could happen to them, that we put up.
They want it to be somebody else.
You've gotta make it somebody else's fault, because that's the only way we can feel safe. So, breaking through and changing that in what we say in the church and helping each other, because I think people mean to be helpful. And they're not, when I was 17, my best friend died in a car crash with the youth fellowship. And I can't tell you how many people said it was God's will. And I'm thinking, I'm not.
I grew up in that church.
Yeah.
It's God's will.
It's God's will, and I thought, I don't think so. I think it was an inexperienced 17-year-old boy driver who was trying to play with somebody in the back seat when he did a curve.
When you, say or admit whatever right it is, that God has a plan. But you don't say it's God's will, what's the?
Well, so I think for me, I mean, this is, big old one, and Christian's been debating this for a few thousand years now. For me, I cannot believe that God plans for these bad things to happen. I don't think God got up in heaven and decided, I'm gonna Jennifer, she's an awfully sweet kid, I'm just gonna have her be destroyed by a child molester. I don't think so. But I do think God so sees resurrection in some of the worst things that happen. My daughter, her name is Jen. Jennifer today is a therapist for trauma. She continues to recognize that she goes to therapy herself all the time and does all the stuff, works with a neurologist because it makes neurological changes in your brain. Trauma. It actually makes physical changes in the brain. And you have to work at overcoming that because you may not be able to ever undo it. But she understands that at a level that makes her a very effective person for trauma. However, she also is riddled with anxiety. And so, I see seeds of resurrection, but necessarily not the whole deal. Just like resurrection for all things. I mean, it's like trying to explain the presence of God that is so elusive. We felt so deserted by God in part of what was going on with our daughter. And yet, on the other hand, when we were in the trial, which was just a horrible kind of experience, but it the guy's in jail for 100 years. It turned out, and this just felt like God. There were 3 bailiffs. All of them were Presbyterian. All of them had been told by their pastors about us, and all of them spent their time praying. And even my daughter, who's mad at God and doesn't like Christians much, said she felt the presence of God in that trial. How does it work? I don't know. I mean, elusive is the best word that I come up with, because he's there, he's God. And it's the same with resurrection. So I think God, for me, the plan is I'm gonna try to fix and bring life out of death every chance. But I don't think God wills bad stuff. I just don't. I've seen too much. You probably seen too much. I mean, when you see, babies born who only live for a few days, and families that go through it over and over and over. And the friend I had at 17, her older brother died of an aneurysm when he was 17, just 2 years before. I don't think God's out of, well, let me see what I can do to this family. I don't think so. So, yeah. Resurrection plan, yes. Puppet master who makes all the bad stuff happen, no. I mean, that violates free will too. And I don't think you can read particularly the scriptures, all of them, and get the idea that God willed all the bad stuff to happen. I mean, then you have to make it that God made David go after Bathsheba and then got mad at him for it. That doesn't make any sense. But I think what is important is for small groups to talk about these things rather than gloss over and not. And I would be really happy if the PCUSA was known to be the church that never said it was God's plan.
Well, it wasn't. It was not just you.
Who are the people that are sitting back anonymously creating the lectionary?
So there were.
And what kind of influences are there to
Yeah.
make it the way that you described?
Well, and we started it, back, it's gotten a little old, we didn't have it for a long time, but Catholics had one, but we didn't really have one. So we decided that was a good idea, because the problem was pastors were getting in ruts, and they were preaching their favorite things, and people were not hearing the whole message. So it was born of all the good reasons, and we did committee, we had a committee.
Obviously.
More than one. And it's funny that you asked that, because I asked my church members going through these Bible studies, why do they think that people left some of this stuff out? And they said, because they're chickens.
I don't disagree with that.
But I mean, in fairness, some of the stuff you mentioned is in the daily lecture.
It's in the daily lectionary. It's just that most folks today do not pay attention to the daily lectionary. They're not in the other read. They go to church on Sunday. If, and not even that often. Yeah.
But I've never been a big fan of the lectionary for a different reason. It seems to me it's kind of a scattershot view of the Bible.
It is.
It's very hard to get the whole scope and theme of the Bible if you're preaching on this passage one week and the next week,
Yes.
the next one. And so it's kind of the pendulum has swung all the way to the other direction.
Yes.
You can't preach on a theme.
Right. And pastors can't. I mean, we are free to say,
Yeah,
stop. Now, it's hard, and I'll tell you the practicalities of it. And I know Westminster kind of does the hymns and the anthems on the basis of the lectionary, because pastors want to be receptive to what's going on in life this week. And so we don't all write our sermons 6 months in advance. But the choir directors need 6 months in advance to work on the music with the choir. And so they want to know, what are you preaching on, Pastor, on June 15th? And so it's a lot easier for Donovan to say, look in the lectionary, because otherwise you've got a disconnect between the music and the message. So you have to work hard. Pastors have to work extra hard with the music ministry to make a whole service together, and that's part of the challenge. I don't know why, I mean, I think it's obvious with some of the texts, they're too graphic, you can't cover it well in 20 minutes. People need feedback, you need to be able to talk about it. Some of the texts really are not easy for worship, and when they were originally told, we didn't have 20-minute sermons back in the day of the storytelling of the Old Testament. People sat around and chewed on these things all day. Nobody wants to stay with Donovan and chew. And that's part of the challenge. So I think they were trying to be practical.
Yeah.
Mm.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, it was nice to be. Oh, goodness, that was amazing.
Mhm. Good to be with all of you and tell you that I do love your church. And someday I hope to call it my church too.
Good.
Sure, wonderful.
When will you be back? When will you be speaking?
When will I be speaking?
When will you be?
Well, I'm retired, so I'm here by invitation.
Oh.
And someday, I did tell Guy, who probably, maybe retired before I ever even get here, because my mom, we thought we'd try to get her moved up, but she's 101 and she's not going anywhere. My husband now has Alzheimer's, and so it's hard to move him. So I'm coming sometime, I don't think, but I don't know when. So I'm here by invitation, as I said. So, yeah. Well, thank you all. You are a very bunch of folks. Thank you.
Have you been to church yet?
I have not, and I don't know, I think I may have to do the online thing because Ally has, 20 Girl Scouts coming up. She had Charlie's birthday party was yesterday.
Oh, wasn't it?
And so she cleaned up the house and now they got a doctor coming talking about changing the vibes.
Oh, gosh, I wish my Amelia was in that Girl Scout group. Oh, goodness. That's Amanda, my daughter Amanda.
Yeah.
Nice to see you. Well, thanks for Oh, yeah. Right, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh. Yeah. Horribly high. I love that. I'm enjoying it. Did you stay in the? Yeah, lovely. Yeah. Oh, we stayed in it years ago, but it's really old, the brick old lot. So we drove over there a couple of. So, and so, look, it's not, yeah.
Yeah.
It reminded us of the one that's longtime, which is also in the bar.
Oh, okay.
Gorgeous.
Okay.
The weather was not wonderful. Oh, you know, the fall. Maybe from the showers, just, stuff.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah. So that was really good points in base.
No, it was, I think, really straight, it was actually.
Yeah.
Frankly, yeah.
Right.
Just, so they've evolved over the years.
Did you notice all those, trees?
Yeah.
They are, apparently a storm came through, was it last October? When did all those, remember we were talking about the, all those?
Yeah, I think, shortly after we bought. Okay. I was at
It was.
Yeah.
Well, you didn't make it. Oh, what they said?
They said, well, first they said, oh, we got a tornado with 20 or something. You know, a lot of.
Well,
businesses.
we cut.
You know, I saw this was still on the road. You know, well, there was something last fall.
Oh.
It might have been a weed, yeah.
Well, that's right.
Yeah.
No, it was something, obviously, nobody, it's fried, fairly fried.
Wow. Something. Straight.
All right, well, let's go. I long quarter of the kind of chat, of course, I was leaving, but, you know, the Ivy were kind and stuff, and, yeah. Gosh. I'm guessing that Al is about our Al's got kids, our graduate, so that would be what, early, yeah, maybe just turns out. Oh, I did. Yeah, but she's not head staff at the church right now, is she? No, she said she was a church. Okay, well, I guess we have church, we can put in the Marietta or out, but I don't know. Out there, or Marietta or another. Well, she's certainly not right. I'm Morristown, short out of the thing. Yeah, no, other activities of the city. She's very qualified. Probably she's the beginning. Yeah, she was a sensation after.